The end of the 2024 season is approaching fast. We just saw the Florida Panthers take home the cup, and now just 4 days later, we've approached the NHL draft. Like every year, tonight is bound to make headlines. We'll see the next NHL superstar in Macklin Celebrini get taken first overall, and like previous years, we'll almost certainly see one team reach on a player, going off the board and shocking the hockey world. But that's what makes the draft fun, as there's been countless picks that have made fans, the media, and even NHL executives heads scratch. I found some unique stories, both recent and historic, that I'm excited to share as we revisit a topic from last year and look back on the most confusing draft picks in NHL history. Remember this?
From asset of the Finnish Elite League, Jesperi Kotkaniemi.
So they go with the center, Bob.
This photo will be plastered everywhere as soon as it hit our screen. Almost everyone remembers this fan's reaction when the Canadians went off the board, taking Kotkaniemi 3rd overall. Now, it wasn't as off the board as some might remember, as leading up to that draft, Kotkaniemi was moving up analyst draft boards. However, very few actually thought they'd take him 3rd overall, especially with other players on the board. But you've all heard this story before, so this isn't the moment I wanted to start with. I mean, at least the analysts knew who Kotkaniemi was. That's more than what one player can say when he got drafted back in 2020.
The Columbus Blue Jackets are proud to select from Avangard Omsk of the Continental Hockey League, Yegor Chinakov.
When Columbus made this selection, the entire hockey world was appalled. And not just because it was a massive reach, but because nobody even knew who he was. Chinakov was ranked 30th amongst all European skaters and wasn't projected to get selected until the later rounds, with the hockey writers projecting him being taken between the 6th and 7th to be exact. Twitter was ablaze with everyone left confused. But the cherry on top of all of this was how the analysts covering the draft reacted. Craig Button was still able to talk highly about Yegor, mentioning this.
He's a goal scorer, and he knows his way around the offensive zone. You know, Bob just talked about players that benefited from playing. Well, Chinakov is that player that benefited from playing in the KHL earlier this year. But if you go back and watch what he did in the MHL last year, which is the Russian Junior League, he dominated it. He's matured, he's developed further.
But over on Sportsnet, they were bamboozled. Watch this moment NHL Watcher on Twitter managed to capture.
Well, I'm sweating. That's completely off the board for me, I gotta tell you. I had not done a lot of work in this guy, to be completely honest with you. I read something recently where he was starting to make some headway and really starting to make a lot of noise. But Fuchs, we're gonna have to defer to you on that one, because Chinakov is not a guy I expected to go here, that is for sure.
I think he's a Russian winger. Right side or left side? He can play both.
We've seen experts before get caught off guard with the selection, but never to the likes of what we just saw. The reaction, mixed with the backlash, could only mean two things. Either Columbus's front office monumentally messed up, or their scouting staff did their proper research, and we were made the fools. Which one is it? Well, the KHL took to Twitter after the selection was made, mentioning how Chinakov recently tallied 5 goals in his last 5 games. And when looking even further down the Hockey Writers scouting report, one writer mentioned, quote, Yegor Chinakov is yet another Russian trending in the right direction. Chinakov's numbers will get him noticed this time around, and NHL scouts should like what they've seen upon further evaluation. This seemed positive, and as of today, Chinakov seems to be, for the most part, what scouts projected him to be, skill-wise that is. Chinakov's been a decent producer, scoring 16 goals in 53 games this season, while mainly playing in Columbus's bottom 6. And just a few days ago, the Jackets extended Chinakov to a 2-year deal worth $2.5 million. So, did they reach by taking him so high? Yes. But they still managed to take a player who can provide a role within the lineup, and at only 23 years old, he has plenty of room to evolve into an even better player.
With our first pick in the 2022 NHL Draft, les Canadiens de Montréal sont fiers de repêcher from the Slovakian national team and TPS Turku, Yuri Slafkovsky.
When Montreal decided to select Yuri Slafkovsky over Shane Wright back in 2022, the decision was somewhat shocking. Wright was a consensus #1 pick, but in the weeks leading up to the draft, the idea that Wright could actually go first overall was becoming more of a question. Montreal still seemed satisfied, however, as Slafkovsky's looked solid during his time in the league, while Wright has yet to look or glare at NHL ice. However, the same thing can't be said when looking back at another first overall selection by the Habs that was made back in 1980. The infamous Doug Wickenheiser selection will forever confuse the Montreal faithful who were around during the time of the selection. The entire saga is one full of what-ifs and blame being placed on everybody everywhere. So to truly understand the story, let's set up the situation. The Canadiens were in a spot they weren't too familiar with, in a transition. Longtime GM Sam Pullock, head coach Scotty Bowman, Pete Mahovlich, and the core of Dryden, Lemaire, and Cornier were all gone. The days of domination were coming to an end, and it was time for a new regime. 1 year removed from the Cup, after losing in the second round of that year's playoffs, they'd secure the #1 pick. How? Well, thanks to a Sam Pullock masterclass from 4 years prior, which allowed Montreal to swap 1980 draft picks with the Colorado Rockies. The consensus #1 pick at the time was defenseman Doug Wickenheiser. So, wait, why is this confusing if he was the best player available at the #1 spot? Well, here's where things get interesting. Despite Doug's insane year in juniors, posting 170 points in 70 games, some scouts in Montreal's system preferred the team take the homegrown French-Canadian forward, Denis Savard. What was a factor back then was that there was a lot of talk of how the Canadiens were too small and needed a big center, said Canadiens captain Serge Savard, and all that tipped the scales at the time. The fans of Montreal also seemed to agree with those scouts, as they too were more confident in Denis Savard. Ultimately, as we all know, the Habs opted to select Wickenheiser to the fans' surprise, but Denis Savard understood why. He'd state in an interview, quote, "They saw I had good strengths, but they saw I had weaknesses too. And when they made their decision, they told themselves, we have a guy who's 6'1" with a lot of talent. Even in today's game, if you see a guy who is big and tall and can skate and has the same talent as the smaller guy, this is still how people see the game." And it's true. Scouts and teams are more likely to select a player with size, even if it means they lose out on potential skill. It still happens as of today. That's what Montreal decided to do, as well as take who they, and many projected to be, the best player in the draft. And although it backfired on them, perhaps they have nobody but themselves to blame, as many have stated that their development of Wickenheiser is what ultimately caused him to fail, healthy scratching him early on once he began to struggle, and eventually trading him away after continuing the struggle just 4 years later. Doug would still be able to shine with the change of scenery in St. Louis, having quite a few memorable moments, while Montreal did end up getting Savard, albeit a much older Savard, but nonetheless, I guess it worked out in the end. To this day, fans of Montreal still insist that they should have selected Savard, and agree that it may just be the most confusing draft pick in the entire franchise's history. This season saw us say goodbye to the Arizona Coyotes. One of the NHL's most drawn-out, tragic sagas finally came to an end when fans gathered to say goodbye to their team as they headed off to Utah to become the Utah Hockey Club. What? The entire relocation process seemed very rushed, and the team failing to even have a logo, name, or identity really reflects that. Regardless, in terms of the transition into the offseason, they were still able to get everything done before the rush of free agency and the draft were set to begin. Now, imagine if they decided to wait, give Arizona even more time to find a home, and then decided to get rid of the club. Let's say 1 day before the draft. Surely that would never and has never happened before, right? Well, don't ask Cleveland that question, because the story of the 1978 Cleveland Barons and the draft that followed is perhaps the best way to end today's video, as the entire process was just a complete and confusing nightmare. In 1976, the California Golden Seals would move to Cleveland and become the Barons, but the franchise would only last until 1978 due to a handful of reasons. The team would miss several payrolls, struggle to generate any funds, and almost folded mid mid-season. They were on their last legs, barely getting by, and finally, come the 78 off-season, the league decided they couldn't let them struggle any longer, announcing that the team would be no more and that they'd be absorbed by the Minnesota North Stars. This would create the most confusing 24 hours in NHL history. To start, the NHL draft was scheduled to be held the following day, so in a mad scramble, the league created a disparate draft, where players from the merged team protected 14 players, and then the 5 poorest teams would get the pick from the unprotected players. Only 2 players were taken, and most notably, the Capitals would decide to drop out of the disparate draft, instead opting to take an additional first-round pick, which they'd use to select Tim Kolis, who played a whopping 47 games in the league. But while we're on the topic of the Capitals, they still play a role later in this debacle. The NHL was able to construct a roster for the new North Stars, but what about the Barons' old draft picks? Obviously, since they weren't a team anymore, they wouldn't be using the picks that were owned by the Barons. Well, the problem was that 2 other teams still own the rights to Cleveland Barons draft picks, via trades they made with the team before they were absorbed. The Islanders owned their 4th round selection, and the Washington Capitals owned their 2nd round selection. How was the league going to compensate the teams who owned the picks? The answer makes 0 sense at all, because the Capitals were still able to keep their pick, which was 23rd overall, while the Islanders, yeah, tough luck, pal, you don't get to keep your pick. Typical 1970s NHL, it was a weird time and clearly had some very weird ways of doing things. Luckily, the Islanders didn't seem to need the pick because they go on to become a juggernaut just 2 years later, going on an insane 5-year run, which saw them appear in 5 straight Stanley Cup finals and take home 4 straight Stanley Cups. The team they lost to was the Edmonton Oilers, who began a 4-year run of their own immediately after. One of the members of that Oilers team who joined midway through their dynasty was forward Craig McTavish, a player that the Islanders could have gotten, as he was taken in the 9th round in none other than the 1978 NHL draft.